Hi everyone, my name's Jon. I'm a committee member for Climate Action Frodsham. I'm also an environmental scientist by training, so I know a bit about climate. I've been studying it for quite a while in various degrees. It's kind of into various bits of research projects I've done. And yeah, I just really like food, so it's a really good sort of crossover between all of my different interests and skills and stuff. So I thought I'd just start with the question, what's a carbon footprint? Has anyone heard of carbon footprint? Put your hand up if you've heard of it. Does anyone want to try and define what a carbon footprint is?
It's the carbon load of any action or product on the planet in the process, right from when it's first grown or first produced to when it has reached the end of its life or eaten.
Yeah, that's pretty much spot on. So yeah, it's the whole embodied carbon that goes into the process of creating either food or products. We can also look at it in terms of businesses or individuals, the associated carbon that goes into their day-to-day operations or personal consumption. But does anyone know where the concept of the carbon footprint actually came from, how this kind of came to be part of our vocabulary that lots of people seem to know about?
BP's marketing department.
Yes. So this is BP's website in 2006. So they started talking about carbon footprint in a big way. You could learn to calculate your carbon footprint with a little handy calculator. They'd recommend you go on a low carbon diet, which is going to be the same thing that I'm about to say, so I don't really want to do their marketing for them, but they were really pushing this whole idea of consumer responsibility. However, we look at BP in recent years, and they, on a broad scale, haven't really done much. So they kind of use this ad campaign as a way to push the responsibility for climate change onto all of us. While they can, lobby against climate-friendly policies, they can mislead the public in their advertising. So it's worth keeping in mind that carbon footprint is a useful idea, but don't forget about things like systemic change and bigger ideas. I think some people can feel quite guilty about their carbon footprint, and I don't think that's always warranted in every case. So, as I've said, it is a useful concept, but try not to lose sight of the big picture. But I am going to start talking about carbon footprint again. So this is your kind of average person in the UK's carbon footprint. We're looking at 13.1 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, so that's anything that is a greenhouse gas, so you might have heard of things like methane as well. It all sort of gets normalised into carbon dioxide equivalent. So if you ever see this figure here, that's basically what that means. And as we can see, food and drink makes up 25% of an individual's carbon footprint in the UK. So it is an area where we can have a pretty big impact through the choices that we make around diet. This was a study that was done in 2017 looking at the different personal choices you can make to reduce your contribution to climate change. These were split into low impact, moderate impact and high impact actions. So around the low impact, it's upgrading your light bulbs to LEDs and things. Moderate impact, you've got cold water clothes washing, replacing your car with a hybrid, recycling, that sort of thing. And then high impact, you've got some of the ones you've heard before, avoiding flying, buying green energy, some more controversial ones like having fewer children. And eating a plant-based diet is actually one of the easiest high-impact actions you can take, I would say. And that's, you can't really see it on here, but that's 0.8 carbon dioxide equivalent units of that 13.1 yearly individual use. So it can have a pretty big contribution.
So what was that? What's the source of that study?
So it's just down there. It's Wynes and Nicholas 2017 environmental research letters. So the graphic itself was put together afterwards, but if you look for that study, the whole paper is available free online, and they look at how the messaging at policy level doesn't always translate to the actual evidence base for a lot of the things that we're being told to do or governments are recommending. It's a really interesting paper if you're into that sort of thing. So this is a pretty complicated graph it's worth spending a bit of time going through it. This is from Our World in Data. They're a really good non-profit who pull together a lot of research across a whole variety of subjects, a lot of things that affect public policy, different things like that. This is the greenhouse gas emissions of food production. And we can see down here we've got a variety of different foods. If you actually go onto the website, you can build a huge graph out of all the different foods that they've done different studies for. So they pull together different studies and different pieces of data to give nice visual presentations like this. So it's worth spending a bit of time going through. You can kind of see up here we've got meat, and then down here we've got more of the plant-based foods. So yeah, as we can see, meat has got generally the highest carbon footprint. Now this carbon footprint is standardized per unit weight of the food. So obviously a kilo of beef is being compared to a kilo of tomatoes here or something like that. So it's worth keeping in mind portion sizes as well when we're thinking about this. But you can see with beef, you're looking at around 99 kilos of carbon dioxide used to produce an equivalent kilo of beef, versus down here something like potatoes actually doesn't sort of spend more than it takes to produce it. So yeah, 80% of food's emissions are due to land use and farm processes. So land use, I think you can kind of see, if I can get my pointer working, that's this green bar here. So it varies depending on the food. And then the brownish bar, if we look at beef here with the big one here, that's farm processes. So land use is things like destroying natural habitats, cutting down trees to make grazing pasture. These are areas that generally have high embodied carbon, and by changing that land to a different use, you're making the kind of land that doesn't really capture a lot of carbon anymore, because all of the carbon is going into growing the meat or that sort of thing. And then farm processes, that's things like fertilizer use, pesticide use, which can have knock-on effects in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as cow farts that you've probably heard about. It's actually more the burps than the farts, but we're kind of splitting hairs at this point. They generate a lot of methane because of the way that their digestion kind of occurs. So that's a big contributor for beef. So you can see things like lamb, mutton, and pigs and poultry. They don't have as big farm process driven emissions. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, which is quite surprising, is that transport and packaging make up less than 10% of the food's combined emissions. So if you look at something, again, if you take beef as an example, that's that tiny little sliver. My shaky hand can't even stay on it. And packaging is just next to it. It's not actually this 14 kilos. So they make a small proportion of the food's combined emissions.
Can I just point out that's a tiny amount of a massive amount, isn't it? So if you took that blue
That's very
and
true.
compared it with a potato,
Yeah.
the packaging and transport is greater on its own without anything.
Yeah, that's very true. That's a very good point. I mean, it is. This also kind of points out how focusing on one particular measure doesn't always capture the whole picture. So, transport. Some of these food transportation systems are ruthlessly efficient because there's a clear economic incentive driving transport to be, worth it for the money's worth. Whereas, clearing a bit of land to grow more cows, there's not really any financial incentive not to do that. There's a financial incentive to do that. And things like packaging as well. We've heard about plastic waste and the problems that causes. That's not really a greenhouse gas emission problem, but it is an environmental problem. So it's worth keeping in mind when you see things like this, that looking at one particular sort of metric doesn't always give you the whole picture, so it's worth considering.
Is this transport to the UK as well?
I think this is global transport, so these
Fantastic.
are different life cycle analyses, different papers that they've pulled together all that information. So it may vary from country to country, but this is sort of broad global sort of data. And yeah, you might have noticed down here, nuts are carbon negative for the most part. This is again due to the fact that trees that produce the nuts generally kind of draw down a lot of carbon and they stay in place and get harvested year on year. Whereas other plants will the whole thing will get pulled out of the ground, all that carbon that was embodied in the non-edible parts. is lost. So nuts are an interesting one. Again, looking at specific metrics. A lot of nuts, especially in like California, you might have heard of almonds and things, really high water use. So again, this doesn't really capture that, so it's worth keeping that sort of thing in mind. So spend a bit more time looking at specific food types. So this is more kind of looking at, sort of doing comparisons of things you might encounter at different sort of food groups. So these are kind of typical dinner time options. So you can see, again, anything beef-based is coming out with the highest carbon footprint here. So these graphs show all of the combined ingredients really and their contributions to the overall carbon footprint of the meal, essentially. But again, you can see things like lamb curry. So if you don't want to make the switch to vegetarian and vegan options, you can make lower carbon footprint choices just within meat itself. You can see chicken curry is actually lower than vegetarian pizza, so that's good, I guess, if you love chicken. So yeah, just avoiding beef can make a huge difference is the sort of take-home message. But you can see a lot of the vegetarian and vegan options down the bottom here are tiny in comparison to some of the meat-based options. So then cheese is all pretty high generally. Obviously dairy-free cheeses around the bottom have the lowest carbon footprint. Dairy-free cheese is good or bad depending on where you get it from. I don't know if anyone's tried it. Some of it is delicious, some of it tastes like plastic. But it's worth considering. So there are some nice ones out there. They typically don't tend to be in the supermarket. They do typically tend to be quite expensive. But again, things like mozzarella, halloumi, and feta are a little bit lower compared to things like cottage cheese and parmesan. So you can make choices within dairy as well to sort of offset your carbon footprint. So alternatives to cow's milk, we've got soy milk, almond milk, and oat milk. Oat milk generally not only has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions, but other environmental factors like water and land use it scores really well on. As I mentioned before, with the nuts, almond milk looks great as a greenhouse gas metric, but the water use associated with that is pretty high. So I think oat milk's probably the best thing to go for if you're looking for a dairy-free alternative to milk. And again, obviously cow's milk is just pretty huge in comparison. So then tea or coffee, we can see these are all pretty similar. And it is worth pointing out, if we looked before at the graph at the start, beef was around 99 kilograms of carbon. So this is pretty high for things like coffee and tea. However, obviously you'll probably be using a little bit less of these. You wouldn't have a kilo of coffee unless it was a particularly difficult week or you've got a newborn child. And yeah, so you don't really have to worry too much around tea and coffee. Instant coffee you do have a little bit higher, but that's probably from the extraction process of removing the coffee from the coffee beans. So yeah, not much to sort of separate out there. And then battle of the booze. So beer and ale is coming out a lot lower in terms of carbon footprint. However, it's worth considering who here has a pint of beer? Who's had a pint of beer in the last week? Who's had a pint of wine in the last week? All right. In a single serving or in a week? So it's worth considering. You'd probably be consuming less wine per serving than you would beer. So if we normalise this to alcohol percentage, this might balance out a bit more. So again, that's another thing.
Do you say like things like cider, for example, which is made, say, from British?
Yeah, so there may be cider data. I couldn't find cider in the list of foods when I was looking online, but there might be some good stuff for cider, especially because it's in the UK and that sort of thing. Yes.
And there's simple tricks with wine, of buying European wines rather than buying South American and Australian wines.
Yeah, I mean,
to know that.
it is worth saying there's a lot of variation around 1.72 depending on where you pick it, and that's true for a lot of different food products. Beef can be there's a really wide variation in the carbon footprint of beef. These are just averages. However, generally speaking, beef is a lot higher than other plant-based alternatives. So there is variation. Those variations do overlap depending on the choices you make within each category. So yeah, it is worth considering the distances travelled and all these other things. And then food waste. So Fiona mentioned that the Women's Institute has got a stall on food waste. I think it's an often overlooked part of food and climate. A quarter of all food production is waste associated when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is lost in supply chains and consumer waste. So individually, we're kind of looking at this little sliver here. Food eating kind of covers everything we've just talked about. This was really surprising to me, but food waste emissions are around 3 times the global emissions from aviation. That's global food waste. So that was pretty shocking. I was not expecting food waste to be that high. And also, if food waste was a country, it would be the world's 3rd largest emitter after the US and China. So yeah, that's quite shocking. A lot of people don't like to waste food, but not many people think about it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And then in terms of what we can do about waste, obviously planning meals and only buying the food you need is one thing. I still waste food. You know, there are situations where something falls to the back of the fridge, or something happens and you end up with a little bit of food waste. Composting is a great way to deal with food waste because it only releases about 14% of the emissions compared to food sent to landfill. So that whole food waste greenhouse gas emissions, that's mostly made by food that's sent to landfill due to the way that it breaks down in landfill versus the way it breaks down in a compost pile. So this is my garden. I've got 2 relatively rat-proof composters. You can get better ones. I might have to upgrade quite soon. But that is 300 litres, and that's about a year's worth of food waste for me and my family. So once that one's full, I start on the next one and give that a year to sort of break down. You can use that compost around your garden. You can use it to make fruit and vegetables. So you can kind of see down here, there's a load of potatoes, some very wilted everything else in the background, so maybe I should have cropped that bit out. But yeah, so you can use the compost in a variety of processes. We also do edible gardening engagement events. We did one at Health and Wellbeing Week in the library in January, which was really good. We made a huge mess in the library, got soil everywhere, it was great. So if you want us to come and make a mess of your local area, we can happily do that, so just get in touch with us. And then finally, we're putting together a community cookbook. So we're going to build it online, and we want people to submit original plant-based, climate-friendly recipes to help each other get started. Oftentimes when I talk to people about reducing their meat intake and their dairy intake, they're like, I don't know where to start, I don't know what I'd sub out. And I normally say to them, come around and have dinner. And then we kind of talk about the different foods and the different things you can make. So here's a variety of plant-based recipes. And so we're just building this at the moment. We've got a couple of recipes. I haven't put them on the website yet, but there is a little form to submit those recipes. So if you have any that you really like, and feel free to send them to us, and then we'll build over the next few months a nice little recipe book for everyone in the community to use, is the plan. So yeah, just to summarise, key points. Personal carbon footprint is a useful tool, but consider supporting policies and political parties that seek to benefit the environment more broadly. Vegetarian and vegan diets do have the lowest carbon footprint, but even adopting these for 1 day a week, as Fiona mentioned, meat-free Mondays, meat-free Tuesdays, maybe you can do a meat-free Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, eventually, who knows. And to reduce your dietary carbon footprint, focus on what you eat over where it comes from. Generally speaking, except for air-freighted foods. Now, it's hard to tell which foods are air-freighted, but generally these tend to be like exotic berries is a big one. You can kind of see where the food comes from when you're looking in the supermarket, but you can't always tell how it got there. That's not always clear on the packaging. So you probably need to do a bit of reading around that. But again, eating local is great, but from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, it's more about supporting local economies than it is about greenhouse gas, which is also an important thing. Don't forget food waste, consider home composting, and submit any recipes to our community cookbook, which we're building over the next few months. So thanks for your time. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything?